The barn was warm in the way that only old barns know how to be warm, not from any fire, but from the bodies of animals and the weight of years pressed into the timber walls. A single oil lamp hung from a rafter hook, throwing a low amber circle across the straw-covered floor, and in the middle of that circle sat a woman with a spinning wheel and a basket of fiber so soft it seemed to hold the lamplight inside it. She was older now, not ancient but seasoned, the kind of settled that comes not from years alone, but from having lived those years all the way through, without turning away from any of it. Her hands moved without hurrying, drawing the fiber out in a long, slow thread, and the wheel turned with a sound like a quiet breath. The rugs on the walls were thick and deep-colored, reddish-brown shading toward amber, and they did not hang there for decoration. They had been made to hold warmth, and they did. The shelves along the back wall held folded blankets stacked to the rafters, and the whole barn smelled of wool and lantern oil and something older still, something that belonged to the animals who had made all of it possible. When the barn door opened, cold air pushed in for just a moment before the girl pulled it shut behind her. She was young, maybe 14, maybe 15, dressed in a coat too thin for the night, and carrying a pair of good wool mittens she had borrowed from her mother. She stood just inside the door, blinking in the lamplight, looking at the rugs on the walls, at the shelves, at the spinning wheel, at the woman's hands. She had come to learn. Her mother had sent her. The whole valley knew, by now, that this was the place to come. The woman did not stop spinning. She let the girl stand there for a moment and look, because she remembered what it was to see this barn for the first time and feel the warmth of it land on you like something you had not known you were waiting for. Then she glanced up. The girl met her eyes and opened her mouth to introduce herself, to explain why she had come, to say something polite. The woman smiled and shook her head gently. She reached into the basket and lifted out a skein of yarn the color of autumn bracken, and she held it out across the distance between them. The girl came forward and took it. It was heavier than it looked, and softer than she had expected, and warm in the way that living things are warm, as though it had not forgotten where it came from. The woman watched her hold it. Then she looked at the rugs on the walls, at the long reddish fibers woven together into something durable and beautiful and useful, and something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and not quite sorrow, but lived somewhere between the two, in the country of things hard won. She said simply, "It started the day I spent my last $12 on something everyone said was worthless." She paused then, the spindle resting still in her lap, and her eyes went somewhere the girl could not follow, not to the walls, not to the lamp, not to anything visible in that warm and rugged room. They went backward, the way eyes do when a person is no longer entirely present, when memory has reached up and drawn them gently down into itself. The auction yard had smelled of sawdust and cold mud, and the particular anxiety of animals who do not understand where they are or what is coming next. It was a county sale held at the end of a long season, the kind where serious buyers arrived with good boots and folded money and a clear idea of what they wanted, and where the auctioneers moved fast because the light faded early that time of year and nobody wanted to be loading cattle in the dark. She had walked the pens before the bidding started, the way she always did, not because she had money to spend, but because she had always believed that you owed an animal at least the dignity of being looked at. Most of what was offered that day was ordinary. Decent stock, healthy enough, priced for farmers with real capital behind them. She moved along the rails with her hands in her pockets and her breath showing white in the cold air, noting things, learning things, spending nothing. Then she turned a corner at the far end of the yard and stopped. They were penned apart from everything else, in a muddy corner near the fence line where the ground was lowest and the standing water had frozen in thin, cracked sheets along the edges. 18 of them. Long reddish-brown coats, so tangled and matted, they looked less like cattle and more like something the field itself had grown. Wide, sweeping horns, some tilted at odd angles from neglect. The thick forelock hair hung over their eyes in heavy curtains, and most of them stood with their heads low, not eating, not looking, just enduring. A few had ribs that showed through, even under all that shaggy coat. They were thin in the way that happens slowly, not from a single cruelty, but from a long season of indifference. Nobody was standing near them. A group of men leaned against the opposite fence, and one of them laughed at something, and the sound carried clean across the yard in the cold air. She stood at the rail and looked at them for a long time. One of the cows lifted her head and looked back through the curtain of her forelock with an eye that was dark and quiet and old in the way that patience is old. There was no plea in it, just acknowledgement. Here I am. I am still here. She could not have explained what moved in her at that moment. She did not try to name it then, and she would not try to name it years later, sitting by that lamp. Some things do not need naming to be true. She had $12 in her coat pocket. She went to find the auctioneer. The auctioneer did not take her seriously at first. He looked at the $12 she laid on the rail in front of him, and then he looked at her, and then he looked back at the money. She told him what she wanted. He said she could have them, and he said it in the tone a man uses when he means he does not care what she does with them. She folded the receipt and put it in her coat pocket next to where the money had been, and that pocket felt very different now, lighter and heavier at once. Getting them moving took the better part of an hour. They were not mean animals, just reluctant, the way anything is reluctant when it has learned not to trust that moving towards something will improve it. She walked slow among them, speaking low and without urgency, and after a while they settled into a loose shuffle through the auction yard gate and out onto the county road. 18 of them, reddish-brown and shaggy, horns sweeping wide, forelocks hanging over dark eyes, their big rough hooves clicking against the packed earth of the road. She walked behind them and a little to the side. The cold air smelled of pine and turned earth, and the faint sweetness of dried grass. The road ran through the floor of the valley before climbing toward her hillside, and so she had no choice but to pass the other farms. That was simply the geography of it. There was no other way home. She noticed the first door open when they were still some distance off. Then, a second. By the time the herd was moving past the row of valley fence lines, there were people standing at their gates and along the road's edge. She kept her eyes forward. She could feel the watching before she heard the words. The tall neighbor was leaning on his top fence rail with his arms crossed, and his wife stood just behind him on the porch step, and they were the ones who laughed first. Not quietly, laughing the way people do when they want to make sure everyone around them hears. He called out that she had bought herself a set of walking rugs. His wife said something to him and he laughed again and repeated it louder, that she had spent her last dollar on 18 mops, and what did she intend to do with them? Sweep the mountain. A few others along the road joined in. It was not vicious laughter. That almost made it worse. It was careless. They thought this was a small and foolish thing, and they were not even bothering to be cruel about it. Only amused, the way you are amused by something that does not matter. She said nothing. She had known they would laugh, and she had no answer for them yet, only her own certainty, which was a thin and quiet thing right then, not yet tested. One of the cows swung her wide horns and kept walking. The gate at the top of the hill was just ahead. She walked to it and opened it wide. The gate swung shut behind the last of them, and she stood for a moment with her hand still on the latch, listening to the laughter fade down the road below. The valley did not care. It kept its own sounds, wind through the high pasture grass, a crow calling somewhere beyond the tree line, the low, uncertain movement of 18 animals that had no reason yet to trust where they had been brought. She turned to look at them properly for the first time on her own land. They were worse than she had let herself admit at the auction yard. Their coats were matted in great clumped tangles, pale with dust in some places, dark with old mud in others. Their ribs showed when they moved. A few stood with their heads low in the way animals do when they have given up expecting much from the world. The youngest of the cows, smaller than the rest, kept drifting to the edge of the group and then drifting back, as if she could not decide whether company meant safety or only more suffering. She had 4 sacks of oats left in the root cellar and a half-bin of dried corn she had meant to carry her own household through until the first market run of spring. She looked at the cattle, and she looked back at the cellar door, and she did not deliberate very long. The first week she split her meals in half. The second week she ate once a day. She boiled the oat hulls into a thin mash and carried it out in the gray mornings before full light, and she stood with them while they ate, speaking low and even, not any particular words, only the sound of a voice that did not intend harm. They were skittish and slow to settle. The tall neighbor had called them mops, and she could see why, tangled and wild-looking, nothing like the clean, blocky cattle in the lower valley fields. 3 of the older cows would not come near her for days. She did not force them. She put the feed down and stepped back and waited, the cold pulling at her coat collar while they made up their minds. She spent those weeks watching. It was what she could give them that cost nothing: her attention, her steadiness, her willingness to stand in the wind and not rush. And because she watched, she began to see. It happened first with the young cow, the small drifting one. The animal had started to let her come close, and one morning she reached out and pressed her palm flat against the side of the creature's neck. Beneath the outer layer of rough, matted coat, beneath all that tangle and filth that the cold had wound into tight knots, there was something else entirely, something she had not expected. Her fingers pressed deeper and stilled. It was soft, not just warm in the way animal hide is warm, soft like something gathered and carded, like fiber that had been prepared, like something that wanted to be held. She stood very still in the cold morning and thought about that. She did not tell anyone what she had felt that morning. There was no one to tell, and even if there had been, she would not have known how to say it without sounding foolish. She only knew that her fingers had found something, and that whatever it was, it stayed with her through the rest of winter like a quiet question she was not yet ready to answer. The cold held long that year. The hillside stayed locked under frost well into what should have been thaw weather, and she kept her attention on the herd, on the feeding, on the slow work of earning their trust. The 3 older cows came around in their own time. Not quickly, and not all at once, but by the time the first muddy patches of ground appeared beneath the retreating snow, all 18 would stand near her without flinching. That alone felt like something worth keeping. Then the season turned for real. The frost softened, the pasture fence posts dripped. Mud came back to the low ground, and the air lost its bite and shifted into something damp and promising. The cows began to move differently, loosening their winter stillness, pressing against fence rails and fence posts, and each other, in that restless way animals have when the cold finally releases its hold on them. And the coats began to loosen with it. She noticed it on the young cow first. Tufts of fiber catching on the rough wood of the fence rail, hanging there in pale reddish wisps that lifted in the breeze. She walked over and pulled one free and held it in her palm. It was different from what she expected, different even from what her fingers had felt in the dark of winter. In the light of an early spring morning, it looked almost delicate, fine, even. She pressed it between her fingers, and it yielded like something that had been worked already, like something halfway ready. She went to the barn and found the wide-toothed comb she used for untangling the worst mats, and she brought it back out and began, slowly, carefully, working it along the cow's flank beneath the outer layer of coarse coat, and the fiber came away. Not in a slow, reluctant trickle, but in generous, airy tufts that gathered against her hand and piled softly in the crate she had set beside her. Warm to the touch even outside the animal's body, finer than wool, finer than anything she had worked with before. She thought of the old woman then. A woman from her childhood, From the years before she had come to this hillside, a woman with dark-stained hands and a spinning wheel that never stopped turning. She had spoken once of cattle in the old country, cattle that wore two coats at once, the rough outer one for weather and the hidden inner one for something else entirely. The warmest thing that grows on four legs, the old woman had said, and the girl she had been had not understood it. She understood it now. She stood in the spring mud with her hands full of soft reddish fiber, and she understood exactly what she had bought. She carried the fiber inside in armfuls, spreading it across the wooden table to dry. It held the warmth of the animal even after an hour indoors, and she kept touching it the way you touch something you are not entirely sure is real. It was real. It was hers. 18 cows, and spring still weeks from finished, and every one of them carrying this hidden thing beneath that rough, weather-beaten exterior the neighbors had laughed at. The spinning wheel was in the root cellar. She had known it was there since the first week she moved to the hillside, buried under a canvas tarp beside a broken butter churn and a stack of clay crocks. She had moved it aside without much thought, assuming it was too old, too seized, too far gone to be useful. She brought it up now into the light. The wheel was stiff, the drive band had rotted through entirely, and she replaced it with a length of twisted cord, working slowly, testing the tension by hand. The foot treadle groaned at first, and then found its rhythm. She oiled the flyer with lard, worked the whirl loose, adjusted and readjusted, until the thing moved with something close to smoothness. It was never going to be a fine wheel, but it would turn. Her first attempts at spinning the fiber were clumsy beyond what she had expected. The fiber pulled apart in her hands, too fine, too airy, nothing like the heavier wool she had watched the old woman work with years ago. She had to relearn the tension entirely, let her fingers go lighter, let the twist run longer before she drew back. She wasted a good handful of the first combing before she produced anything that held together. What she did produce was rough and uneven, thick in some places, thin in others, but it was yarn. It was genuinely yarn. She kept at it through the long summer evenings after the outdoor work was done, combing out the dried fiber, sitting at the wheel in the barn doorway where the last light lasted longest. The rhythm of it became something she looked forward to without quite meaning to, the slow, meditative turning, the way the fiber fed through her fingers and came out on the other side as something new, something with a use and a future in it. By midsummer, she had found her tension. By late summer, her yarn was consistent enough that she began to weave, working on a simple frame loom she had built from salvaged lumber, using a method she half remembered and half invented, checking the warp threads by feel more than sight in the lamplight evenings. The blanket took most of autumn to finish. Dark reddish-brown, the color of the cows themselves, thick and close woven, and heavier than she had expected when she finally cut it from the loom. She pressed her face into it before she did anything else. The warmth that came back against her skin was not like ordinary warmth. It was deep, settled, absolute, like the warmth that lives inside stone after a long summer. She folded it and set it on the shelf. She showed no one. The feed store in those days was a gathering place as much as it was a place of business. Men came to buy grain and stayed to talk. Women came for seed or salt or lamp oil and found themselves caught in the slow current of valley news before they could reach the door again. It was warm inside, or warm enough, and in the weeks before first frost, there was a particular restlessness in people, a need to measure their own preparations against their neighbors, to find comfort in the collective counting of stores. She went on a Wednesday, just after mid-morning, when she hoped the crowd might be thin. It was not thin. The tall neighbor was there, leaning against the counter with the ease of a man who owned the space he stood in. He had his hat pushed back, and his voice up, addressing the small knot of men beside the grain bins, as though they were a jury he had already won over. She heard her own farm in his words, before she was fully through the door. She heard the word cows, and she heard the word milk, and she heard winter, and she kept her face still and moved to the far end of the counter where the feed sacks were stacked. She did not hear every word, she heard enough. He said she had gotten no milk worth speaking of from those shaggy animals. He said the cattle she had dragged home looked like something out of a fairy story, not a working farm. He said a woman trying to winter on that rocky hillside with 18 useless beasts and no river access and no real pasture was going to find herself very hungry before the snow melted. He said it the way people say things they believe are simply true, without cruelty in their voice because they do not feel cruelty is necessary, because they are only stating what is obvious to everyone present. There was some laughter, not loud, the comfortable kind. She set her order on the counter and waited while the storekeeper tallied it. She paid what she owed. She did not look across the room. Outside, she loaded the feed sacks into her wagon with the same steady motion she used for everything, one sack at a time, no hurry, no hesitation. The horse stood patient beside the post. The sky was the color of ash, the kind of sky that means the cold is coming in earnest and will not be going back for a long time. On the drive home, the valley spread out below her, and she watched it, without particular feeling, the way you watch a thing you have made a decision about and do not need to revisit. In the barn that evening, she combed out the last of what the cows had left on the fence posts and sorted it into the basket. On the shelf above her head, 7 folded blankets sat in a row, heavy, dark, close woven. She had not shown them to anyone. She was not sure yet what they were building toward. But she was beginning to suspect. The storm came on a Thursday. She knew it was coming before anyone else did, not because she was clever about it, but because she had spent enough mornings watching the sky from that hillside to know what certain clouds meant and what certain silences in the animals meant. The cows had pressed together in the low corner of the pasture 2 days before the snow fell, standing flank to flank the way they did when something cold and serious was moving toward them from the ridge. She had seen it in their posture, the way you read a letter before you open it. She moved the extra hay into the barn that same afternoon. The snow began soft, the way it always does, as if it means nothing. By nightfall, it had weight to it. By morning, the county road was buried past the lower fence posts, and the sky was still coming down. The kind of snow that does not ask permission, and does not hurry, and does not stop. By the second day, the valley was quiet in the way that means cut off. The supply wagons that came down from the mountain pass twice a week did not come. The road was not passable and would not be for some time, and everyone in the valley understood this without being told. In her barn, she was warm. The cows generated their own steady heat, 18 shaggy bodies close in the hay, their breath rising in slow white clouds that settled and drifted like something alive. She had enough feed, she had enough wood, and above her head, the blankets sat on the shelf in their folded row, still uncounted by anyone but her. Elsewhere in the valley, the cold became serious within 3 days. The houses down in the lower farms were not built for this kind of freeze, or they had been built for it once but the years had worked on them. Gaps in the walls and thin shutters and wood piles that had looked sufficient in October and looked different now. The tall neighbor's house had a good stone fireplace. She had heard it spoken of, but a fireplace heats one room and a farmhouse has others. His wife had been known to pride herself on the quality of their wool stores, the wool from their proper sheep, properly raised. That wool was in the chest in the bedroom, she imagined, same as it had been before the storm. Wool enough for what they had planned on, which was a normal winter. This was not a normal winter. She heard later that the church hall had been opened up, that 2 of the lower families had gone there to share heat. She heard this from nobody directly. She heard it the way you hear things in a valley when no one is moving much, in the quality of the silence, in what is not happening that usually does. That evening she carried a lamp to the shelf and stood looking at the blankets for a long moment. She counted them. She thought about the people in the valley below. She had known this was coming. She reached for the nearest one. The knock came the next morning. barely audible beneath the wind. She opened the door to find a woman standing in the snow with two small children pressed against her sides, their faces buried in her coat. The woman was younger than her by a year or two, a widow since the spring, farming a thin patch of bottomland alone. She was not the kind of woman who asked for things. That much was visible in every line of her face, in the way she held her chin level, even as her lips trembled from the cold. She did not say much. She said she had heard, somehow, that there might be something to spare. She said she was sorry to come up the hill like this. The young woman stepped back from the doorway without a word and brought out 2 blankets from the shelf. Heavy ones, the kind that smelled faintly of the barn and the animals and the long, slow work of spring. She folded them over the widow's arms, and that was all. No price asked, no lecture given, no mention of who had laughed or what had been said at the auction yard 2 years before. The widow looked down at the blankets for a moment and then looked up. She didn't say thank you in words, but the young woman saw it, and that was enough. By the second day there were others. Word moved the way it does in a valley sealed by snow, not by speech, but by some current underneath speech, some shared understanding that runs between farmhouses when the road is gone and people are managing what they have and finding it not quite sufficient. Families came up the hill one by one. A man with an elderly mother who could not stay warm. 2 brothers from the eastern edge of the valley whose stove had given out. A woman whose youngest was sick and shivering. She gave what she could to each of them. She charged nothing. She did not keep account. The tall neighbor and his wife came last. She saw them from the window before they reached the door. They walked slowly, close together, not speaking. His wife had a proud, careful way of moving that the snow did not erase entirely, but softened somewhat. When they knocked, the young woman answered the same as she had answered every other knock that week. She brought blankets. She handed them over. She did not make them speak more than they were willing to speak, which was not much. The wife looked once around the inside of the barn doorway, at the rugs hanging from the rafters, at the shelves, at the lamp burning steadily in the cold air. She said, quietly, that she had not understood. The young woman nodded once. She did not say that she knew. She did not say anything at all that could have shamed them further. She simply closed the door against the cold and went back inside. The freeze did not lift for another 9 days. She kept count, not by marking a wall, but by the number of trips she made between the barn and the door, the number of times she pulled back the bolt and let the cold in and handed something warm out. By the end of it, the shelves that had been stacked to the low rafters held almost nothing. The folded blankets were gone. The heavy rugs were gone, carried off on shoulders and in arms to cottages and farmhouses all up and down the valley road. The woven vests and the thick wool wraps and the small square pieces she had made without a particular plan, not knowing then that they would one day serve as an extra layer over a sick child's chest, all of it gone. She kept 3 blankets for herself and 2 for the animals that needed them most. That was all. It did not feel like loss. It felt, strangely, like the room had finally said what it was always meant to say. The cows moved through those last days of the freeze with the same unhurried patience they always had. Their long coats were thick and untroubled by the cold in a way that still made her marvel quietly. She brushed them each morning. She spoke to them in low sentences that were not quite words. The old led cow with the wide sweeping horns stood at the gate each day, as though taking inventory of the sky, deciding whether she approved of the weather's plans. When the road finally cleared and the supply wagons came through again, something had already changed in the valley. She noticed it first at the feed store. A man who had not spoken to her directly in 2 years held the door. A woman she barely knew touched her arm briefly as they passed in the cold outside and said nothing, but the touch meant something, the kind of touch that carries a whole sentence inside it. People looked at her differently, not with admiration exactly, not yet, not in any large or stated way. It was quieter than that. It was the way a person looks when they have revised a long-held thought and are still getting used to the new version of it. They looked at her the way you look at a road you dismissed as useless, and then one day, desperate and half-frozen, found yourself walking home on. She did not change the way she carried herself. She bought feed. She checked the price of dried corn. She thanked the man at the counter and walked back up the hill in the thinning snow with her horse and her empty cart, the same as she had always done. But the valley had shifted under her feet like settling ground, quietly, permanently, without ceremony. The road opened on a Thursday. She heard it before she saw it, the distant sound of wheels on hardpack, the creak and jingle of a loaded wagon working its way up through the pass. She had been in the barn when it came, standing with her hand resting on the neck of the oldest cow, the one who had been the sorriest of the 18 when she first brought them home, and was now the steadiest, the one who stood at the gate each morning as if she had appointed herself to the task of greeting the day. The young woman stepped outside, and there it was, a dark shape moving along the county road below, slow and deliberate, leaving twin ruts in the last thin crust of snow. She went back to her work. It was 2 days before the merchant found her. He came up the hill in a light cart, a broad man in a heavy coat, who introduced himself as a trader out of the next town over, a man who dealt in textiles and dry goods and anything worth moving between valleys. He had heard about the blankets from the church hall. He had heard about the rugs from the minister's wife. He said he did not fully believe what he had heard, and so he had come to see for himself. She brought him into the barn. He did not say anything for a long moment. He walked the length of the room slowly, touching the rugs that hung along the walls, lifting the edge of a folded blanket from the shelf, pressing it between his palms the way a man tests something he suspects might be better than he expected. The cows watched him from their stalls with their quiet, curtained eyes. He turned to her and named a price. She looked at him evenly and named another. He studied her face for signs of uncertainty. He found none. They settled on a number between the two, and it was closer to hers than his. She noticed he did not seem displeased by that. A man who moves goods for a living respects the person on the other side who knows what they have. He told her the quality rivaled anything imported from back east. He said the weight of the fiber was unusual, the warmth exceptional, and that people in towns with money to spend would pay well for something this honest and this well made. He asked how much she could produce in a season. She told him. He nodded slowly, doing arithmetic behind his eyes. They shook hands in the barn doorway with the cold, bright light coming off the snow, and the 18 Highland cows shifting quietly in their stalls behind her. The farm that had been her last $12 was now something else entirely. She could feel the shape of it changing, the way ground changes when the frost finally lets go and the soil begins again. She stopped there. The lamplight had not moved, but the barn felt somehow smaller and warmer than it had at the start of the telling, as though the story itself had drawn the walls in close. The young girl sat on the overturned crate with the skein cradled in both hands, not quite ready to speak, her fingers working slowly along the fiber, the way you work the edge of something you are still trying to understand. The older woman reached over and adjusted the lamp's wick with the practiced ease of someone who has done it 10,000 times in 10,000 evenings. The flame steadied. The shadows on the walls, the hung rugs, the folded blankets stacked in rows, the long curved horns of the nearest cow just visible over the stall gate, all settled back into their shapes. She watched the girl's face. She remembered being that face. She remembered holding something soft and being told it was worthless and nearly believing it. She leaned forward and closed the girl's hands more firmly around the skein. The fiber was warm from where it had rested near the lamp, dense and gentle at once, the way good things tend to be. Outside, the mountain dark pressed against the barn walls the way it always did in deep winter, patient and absolute, indifferent to whatever small lights people managed to keep burning inside it. But inside, the light held. It had always held, here, That was the thing she had built, and built slowly, and built with her hands and her stubbornness and her willingness to see past what other people told her to see. She said, "The land will always reward you for seeing what others refuse to look at." She said it quietly, not as a lesson delivered from above, but as a thing she had learned on her knees in cold mud, with her last $12 already spent and no way back. The girl looked down at the yarn. She turned it over once. The 18 cows, older now, as she was older, their red coats thick and unhurried, shifted in their stalls with the slow ease of animals that have never once been afraid in this particular barn. Their breath rose in small soft clouds and disappeared. The rugs on the walls had been made from their fiber, the blankets on the shelves, the warmth in the room. All of it had come from the same place, from the willingness to kneel down in an auction yard and see something living in what everyone else had already written off as dead weight. The girl finally looked up. Her eyes asked the question before her voice did. The older woman smiled and reached for the comb on the workbench beside her and said, "I'll show you how it starts."